All right. Well, thank you again all for being here. Thank you for those songs. Really enjoyed that. So, for this last session here, I really want this to be more of a time of testimony and just, I want to share with you just some things that God has been doing in our congregation, and as we have engaged this question at Berea. And so I really do want you to, I don't want to be here as the person that has this figured out, because we don't. And I also want to be here as for sure as an extension from Berea Christian Fellowship. Like, we are on a journey just like you are in understanding how does this look for us to have an impact on our communities. And so maybe there are some differences maybe in our congregations, and one is that Berea, the history of Berea is actually a little over 60 years. It's 60 years old since its beginning, and so there is a sense of culture there, maybe, if you will, that runs deep and has been there for a long time. Some of that history isn't very pretty. In fact, there was a division, an unhealthy division, in the first 10 years of that church plant being started. And so I would say the first 30 years, Berea was a small little congregation, well under 100 people, that was really barely hanging on. Sometimes 50 or less people, just a few families, and really, just hanging on. And so I say all that to say that some of that has shaped the culture there, in that there's a culture at Berea where the congregation is quite okay if we don't all look and act the same. More so than I have seen in a lot of Anabaptist cultures. And I don't say that, that's just what we've experienced, and that has manifested itself in over the years, even going back into the 90s. There's quite a few people from non-Mennonite backgrounds who at one time or another have had some interaction with that congregation. And so it's somewhat normal for us to have people different, at least somewhat different than ourselves. Maybe one of the first that we bumped into it, that my wife and I, as we had started attending there in about 2008, we came in just on the tail end of a man named Chuck Connon. And Chuck traveled from Chicago, starting in the late 90s for close to 10 years. He came from Chicago almost every Sunday to fellowship with the body there at Berea. That Chuck was he was an older man and was fairly well versed in Scripture, and he has today. Pastor Keith for sure would say that Chuck's life had a major impact on how he teaches and how he has learned to kind of think outside the bubble because of the influence of this man named Chuck. The conclusion to Chuck's story is that just a few months ago he passed away, and Pastor Keith had the privilege of going to Chicago and officiating at his funeral. And so that was just a blessing to have him be a part of our story, and for us to also then be a part of his story. His family was somewhat broken. His wife had passed away a number of years earlier, and some of his children weren't necessarily all on the same page, and so it was a blessing for Keith to be able to officiate in that way. The children really appreciated that, and so that's that's starting back over 25 years ago, and that certainly has shaped who Berea is today. I'd also like to share the story of Irvin Stacy. So my friend Jonathan Hostetler, some of you might have met him. He is often at the ADC assemblies. He works in sales at Ramco Supply, where they manufacture metal roofing and siding, and so he works in sales there. And so I actually worked there as well a number of years ago, back in 08 to about 15. And back then, around, I would say, from what I recall, around the year 2010, this man, Irvin, who was a neighbor there at the business, he would occasionally drop by just to fellowship, just to chat. And it became a little bit of a I don't know if joke's quite the right word, but it was, oh well, here's Irvin again. What does he want? Is he going to buy a big order or something? And he just he'd like to talk about politics, and he'd like to just needed somebody to talk to, really. Well, Jonathan, more than the rest of us, I'll say, took an interest in Irvin. And Irvin's wife had passed, and his children were, he didn't have a good relationship with his children. They basically had disowned him, or maybe vice versa. I'm not entirely sure, because we always only heard his story. But he professed to know Jesus, but then almost in the same sentence would say things that just really left a question mark. And so Jonathan took my friend Jonathan took a real interest in Irvin and took time for him. And so this continued, Irvin stopping in there for a number of years. And then I quit working there, did some other things, but Irvin, I would often ask Jonathan, so Irvin Stacy, what? He stops in, and towards the end, he would stop in almost every day. Mid-morning, here comes Irvin Stacy, and what would happen towards the end there is he would come in and he would sit at Jonathan's desk, and Jonathan would just, chit-chat with him a little bit, but keep on working and take phone calls and just do his thing. And Irvin he'd sit there, maybe talk a little bit. And that went on until just a few years ago, and I've kind of lost track, but I'm going to say about 3 or 4 years ago, Jonathan knew that, his health wasn't well, and sure enough, one week, he didn't show up for a few days, and so they investigated and found that he had passed at his house by himself. He had no other connections. And so I asked Jonathan, so how do you think that Irvin met the Lord? And his response was, well, I don't know. We can leave that to the Father. But I share this story. This story has impacted me because I've known Irvin for a long time, and not really well, but knew who he was. And the thing about this story is that Irvin never attended Berea. He never came to church. And yet, I know that this experience has deeply impacted Jonathan, of caring for this man that we can only leave it to the Father. Did he know or did he not? And so this experience of caring about somebody and desiring them to have that relationship, that changes us. That has an impact on us. And so Irvin's story it's a story that I love the story, not so much for how we don't know how it has impacted Irvin, but it has shaped, for sure, Jonathan, and it has shaped me as well, I would say. I'd also like to, share with you the story of Luigi and Laura Both. So, a young couple, he grew up in Chicago, met Laura, who had grown up, I believe, in Columbia City, Indiana, which would be about an hour east of where we're at. And when they got married, he was kind of a scholarly historian, maybe. He grew up in a Lutheran setting, somewhat nominal, mainline Christian, and he became somewhat intrigued with the Amish, and so he spent some time in northern Indiana, kind of touristy, visiting the Amish. But kind of through that, began to read the Word and realized that, kind of buried in this Amish culture tradition, there are some real values that really are worth investigating. And so one day, I believe it was in 2015 or 16, Pastor James received a phone call from a man named Luigi Both. They had just moved to Bremen, and they were looking for a church. And so they began to attend. And this a journey of a few years there for them to, they had a lot of questions, and she was not entirely bought into attending this little church out in the country, and at that time, it was before we had moved to Napanee. But they did become members, and they did, I would say those first several years, it was a few years after they became members, they were fairly connected and fairly involved. Tragically, Luigi died from a ruptured or a enlarged heart very unexpectedly about 3 years ago. I lose track. It was in the spring. It would be right at about 3 or 4 years ago. And so, we had his funeral. And through that, we made some connections with some people at some of his family from Chicago, including his mom, who was not a churchgoer. And so, Laura still attends, is still a member today, and has, I would say, acclimated fairly well. They have one daughter who's now going on 4. And so, again, that journey, that story, that experience has shaped us, right? This has been, that's not, when we think of impacting someone, we don't think of some of those dynamics of how we become involved in their story. And a part of that is, so when Luigi's mom passed here about 2 years ago, Laura asked us if we would officiate her funeral. And so Pastor Keith and I made the trip to Chicago to, I'm not even sure, for sure where it was anymore, but downtown Chicago, to some funeral home, and we had a service there at the funeral home. Pastor Keith preached a short message, and then I did the committal at this massive cemetery in Chicago for this, that's an opportunity that, if we are not intentional about reaching outside of our bubble, that experience has impacted me. So it wasn't a large funeral, but there was a pretty good group for a funeral like that for an older lady. And so what do you say when the majority of the audience is non-Christians? And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know today how that experience has impacted those people, but I know how it has impacted Pastor Keith and I. Those things shape and form us, having had that experience. Another story that's just kind of a neat story is of Joanne Harmon. So Willis and Alice Hostetler, older couple in our congregation. I'm not even quite sure how they met for sure, but Joanne Harmon was an older lady in her early 80s, I think at the time, because she's getting close to 90 now. Willis and Alice befriended her, and she didn't have a lot of connections at that time, and so they, I would say, really became her friends and started bringing her to church, and so, this I'll never forget this. The first Sunday that she was there, that we had communion, she stood up and joined and had communion with us, and we never really had any conversation necessarily, and we didn't pursue it necessarily as a leadership team either, about at her age, we were fine having her be a part of us in that way, and so she has essentially become a part of us. She actually is in a nursing home now, and there's a number of especially Willis and Alice, but a number of older, some of the older single ladies that are connected with her, and she just like we are her church. That is, she has told us over and over that at her age and her stage of life, if she wouldn't have us, she wouldn't have anybody. She would be in the nursing home by herself. And so, yeah, just a neat story. She doesn't come every Sunday, but she's in a wheelchair and on oxygen. But it's always. I love seeing when she wheels in the back and we have a spot where she can sit in her wheelchair, and she's always so delighted to be a part of the body. Another story that I love is that has shaped us maybe more than the other party. But so we have a dear brother, Gary Miller, who is a part of our congregation. Gary grew up in a Mennonite home as a young boy, but made some poor choices fairly early in life and lived a very rough life. Was incarcerated several times. He did marry and have a few children, but his wife ended up leaving him. And just, a sad story. And for years, he just, deflected responsibility and deflected blame. But he was, early in his life, fairly good friends with Pastor James. And so Pastor James, by the way, at Berea, we also have a Pastor James, just for those of you so there's no confusion. But so James spent quite a bit of time with him, and the Lord got a hold of Gary's life while he was incarcerated, and through the work of a chaplain there and so when he was released, he contacted James and began attending, and is a member currently, and that's a good story there. But Gary has some children, and so over the years, from time to time, his children would visit, and so his children. I'm not quite sure where to put them. I might put them in the nons category. They would kind of profess to be believers, but really don't attend church on a regular basis and don't have good, close connections. And so our experience with them, the experience that I love, that was impactful for me, they were visiting one Sunday morning that while we were having communion. And so, this guy is fairly big and has long hair, and he's there in a t-shirt, and he has a number of tattoos, and definitely from outside of our bubble, right? And so he's there. He's married to Gary's daughter, and they're there visiting, and we have communion. We preach the message, and then we share the emblems. And so they get up and they come around and take part of the emblems, and so at that point we're fine with that. But here's how this has impacted our congregation. So after we do the emblems, then we have a short teaching on the foot washing and do our foot washing. And so Paul and Trish Yoder were sitting in front of them, and they're fairly good friends with Gary as well. Paul and Trish have been at Berea for quite a long time. They didn't grow up there, but and so they're in their early 60s. I love Paul and Trish, and so Paul and Trish turn around and say, "Hey, we'll wash your feet." I have no idea how that has affected them. But they were not expecting that. And it was completely, here's this big guy. If you would meet him on the street, he's tough. And, Paul, if you know Paul, he's just a little guy, like pretty little actually. So he gets down and washes his feet. And this man's just weeping. He's just never experienced somebody giving like that for no reason. So, I don't know, they don't come regularly. I don't know how that has shaped their lives. But that does something for us. That gives us a burden. I want more of that. I want to experience giving when there is no possible chance of reciprocation. Because that's what the Father did for us. So Gary's story is an important part of our story at Berea. We also have Richard and Martha Neff, their family, that began attending, I'm going to say about 4 years ago. And both of them grew up in Texas, and she is Hispanic. She actually came across with her mom when she was, I believe, 3. And what brought them to Indiana is that his dad lived close to Napanee. And when he was young, his dad, his parents divorced, or his mom left and moved to Texas. And so Richard grew up absent father. And mid-late teens met his dad for the first time, and they began to have somewhat of a relationship, kind of a distant connection. There really wasn't a lot of animosity or problems. It was just distant and not really connected. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, Richard's dad here in Indiana is getting older and becoming unable to take care of himself. And so Richard felt led by the Lord to move back to Indiana and take care of his dad until he passes, and then, they would move back to Texas. That was kind of the plan. Well, while they were here, they have 2 twin boys that are now ages 14, I think, or say 2 boys that are twins. Well, so while they were here, they wanted they wanted a private school of some kind. They weren't quite comfortable with using public school, and so they became connected through school. Through school, started attending church. And so what I like about Richard's story is, first of all, is why he came. He had no obligation to come and take care of his dad. But here again, so his dad did pass, and so we were able to assist with the funeral and the burial of his father, and just to be with them during that time. They aren't members at this point, but I would, they definitely are very well connected and are engaged with our congregation. So, how long can I go? Is there a time limit? How many stories should I share? I'd also like to share with you. I'd like to share with you Iva's story, Iva Gingrich. So, Iva came to us as Iva Summers. She grew up in a Mennonite home in one of the Carolinas, and was somewhat a little disillusioned with life and just what is she going to do. She spent some time at SMBI and met Candace Yoder, who would be a daughter to Pastor James there at SMBI, and I think there was a few guys there as well that she met, and became fairly good friends with Candace. And so after SMBI, wasn't sure what to do, and Candace invited her to Indiana. Just, come here if you're not, and so she did. And one of the reason I share, actually, there's several reasons why I share her story. One reason is that just a few weeks ago, she stood up, or she shared during our sharing time and testified just how grateful she is. She's married now to Nate Gingrich. They have one little boy, almost 1 year old. And she just testified how grateful she is to be here with the body at Berea, because there was a time in her life when she was very disconnected and disillusioned with who God was. And one of the things that brought her to Indiana was because her friends that she had at SMBI always had a good report of their church, like they had a good experience. Candace and I forget who the guys were that were there at that time, but they loved their church and they had a good experience. And so when Candace invited her, well, if you don't know what else to do, come. You can find a job here and come to our church if you want. I remember those first several months, first several years. We're just, so grateful to have her there. Truly a story of a person growing into mature manhood. She has really found a home. And so another reason I share her story is to say that, so for us as Anabaptist people who are talking, our topic today is talking about being outside the bubble. This isn't to the exclusion of some of those within the Anabaptist circle. And just if we're honest with ourselves, there's actually a lot of Anabaptism that is unhealthy. And there are people in that circle, in that broad circle, that need connection and need healing and need Jesus just like everyone else. Nancy Wenger would be another story similar to that. Nancy grew up in a fairly conservative Mennonite home, and early in her life kind of didn't necessarily walk away from Jesus, but attended several different churches throughout her life, made a career out of teaching in the public school system, and the last 15, 20 years or so was a part of MCUSA, like Mennonite USA Conference Church, and became somewhat, I guess her eyes were opened, or she became dissatisfied with some of the direction that was happening there with, just some of the choices that they've made. And so she began attending our church, very, almost in a hesitantly, I guess I would say. I was going to say grudgingly, but not grudgingly, but very hesitantly and cautiously. And so that has opened the door. Again, at this point, she's not a member, but just had some interaction with her several weeks ago regarding one of the messages that Pastor James had preached, and where she expressed very just deep appreciation for. Pastor James actually had a message regarding marriage and divorce, and so she expressed the appreciation for how that was presented, and that it is because of how those truths are presented that she is finding value and wants to attend, even though the change is huge for her. There's a young man named Samuel Perez. Again, he became acquainted through work. Somebody that he was employed at a bakery there as a young teen, where Marilyn Hostetler, who is a sister to Jonathan Hostetler, so this trait runs in the family a little bit there, but they are maybe a little more comfortable than some of us engaging anyone at whatever level they are at. And so this has been a process of 6-7 years, but he did take our new members class, and has become, over the last 2 years or so, he's becoming more connected and more engaged. He does his parents are divorced, and he comes from a little bit of a troubled background, and just had some things that still has some things like all of us do to work through, and it's an amazing opportunity to have connections like that. When you have someone like that become a part of your group, right, of your people, then that changes who you are. I feel a little bit like the writer of Hebrews there in Hebrews chapter 11, when he says that time would fail me to write of all these people yet. But one more story in the last year, about a little over a year ago. One of the gals in church had some somewhat vague connections, but had connections with a family from Ukraine. They had come from Ukraine to Florida, and that opportunity in Florida had kind of dead-ended, and so we ended up, as a congregation, helping them find a house to live in. Sergey and Anastasia are their names, and they come to Napanee literally with 2 suitcases, and they have 2 little children, a little boy ages 4 and a baby, a little girl at that time, 6 months old or so. And so, wow, that just, we think sometimes that we are on tough times. We might think that. These people literally had nothing. And so we were able to help them find a house. And Sergey has actually also, so we've started as the company, our company, Diamond Steel Roofing, we started employing him last summer. He had a lot of PTSD, and later in the summer, he wasn't hardly able to do the physical work, and so he stopped over winter, and we were able to help him get some counseling, some therapy for his PTSD. Also, were able to help them get some marriage counseling. Their marriage was, when you're constantly in flight mode, you really can't. They just didn't know how to navigate relationship. And so, he has recently told me that, he sees that, and so these people would have been Christians. They would have known Christ, but and attended church in Ukraine, but fairly nominal. Their understanding of theology wasn't really very deep at all. And so he told me just recently that he knows now why God brought them from Florida to Indiana, because we were able to, he says, he's speaking to me, he said, you showed me how to do relationship, and you showed me what good doctrine is. And so, we give that glory to the Father. We are grateful to be a part of their story, and they attend church occasionally. She would be a little bit more inclined to. Actually, she would have been a musician, and what they were accustomed to was much more of a contemporary, charismatic type of worship, and so it's just been a big change. And so they're not there every Sunday, and we haven't demanded that from them at all. So I share these stories just to testify of what God has done and is doing at Berea. It's certainly not to claim any glory for us, I will. I think I'll turn the time back to James, and then you can take it from here. So.